Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Growing more with less is the mantra of Nebraska's corn farmers, and they're using incredible technology to do it. Soil moisture monitors let them know when their crop needs water and how much. GPS systems eliminate overlaps in the field, saving fuel and money. New hybrids reduce the use of pesticides and increase yields. When you're talking new technology and innovation, Nebraska corn farmers are all ears. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Luke Beckman looks at the USDA's quarterly grain stocks report. Lee Schulz analyzes hog prices and break-evens. Brad Lubben gives an ag policy update, and Bruce Anderson explains what producers should keep in mind when cutting alfalfa during October. Luke Beckman from Central Valley Ag is our corn and soybean market analyst this week. The USDA's quarterly grain stocks report showed corn and soybean stocks on September 1st were significantly higher than a year ago, but not far off from trade estimates. The agency tallied corn in all positions 41% higher than September 2014, and soybeans in all positions 108% higher. Nebraska's corn stocks were estimated 29% above a year ago. Soybean stocks were more than twice as much. We talked with Luke at CVA's facility near Tamora, Nebraska Thursday afternoon, and started by asking for his thoughts on the USDA's estimates.
Well, the bean number was good to see. Last year's crop size come down a little bit. Really no surprises that it did, though. You know, disappearance during that fourth quarter was up considerably from a year earlier. So the USDA goes back. They were kind of forecasting this with higher residual use throughout the year, but we do go back and lower last year's crop size by 42 million bushels. That's coming from a reduction in harvest acres, and they did pull the yield down from last year by 0.3 bushels. So the trade was not too surprised. Does it have any long-term implications? Not really. We're really just staring at a big crop coming at us, and it's, you know, that's what's dictating market direction right now.
Let's talk about usage and focus on corn first for livestock feed and for ethanol. What does it show us how we're eating up the corn crop?
Well, the stocks report basically implied that, you know, disappearance over that fourth quarter was certainly up, and feed usage really over the third and fourth quarters up 28 to 29%. So on-feed numbers were higher in cattle and hogs at the start of that fourth quarter. Broiler hatch, those numbers up as well, kind of as we get through the bird flu. So there's a lot of animals on feed right now, and I think that really that gives us kind of a good conversation as we get into the first quarter of 2015-16 marketing year, because if the fourth quarter was robust, you could expect that first quarter feed demand is going to be pretty good here for 15-16.
For soybean demand, tell me where exports have been and where you might see them going.
They've been a struggle.
Yeah.
Now, 2014-15, soybean exports just kind of ballooned on us. They continued to grow every single time we saw the USDA numbers, but this past year it's been a struggle. We're down about 30% from where we were a year ago as far as pace on sales. Now, China did step in a week ago. They did their ceremonial purchase, but it doesn't change the fact that there's available beans in South America, and really the currency discrepancies between what's going on with the Brazilian real and the US dollar, it's kind of hurting us as well. So not a lot of bright prospects for exports matching what we did a year ago.
You hinted at the big crop. What are you hearing for harvest results?
Really good in our locale. I mean, we've had really good bean yields early that have come out. We're just kind of getting started with, you know, the weather and what it's doing. It's creating some challenges, but bean yields have been very good. A lot of wet corn to feedlots, and some of those early numbers coming out really give us an indication that we've got a good crop in Nebraska and the Western Corn Belt in general.
Do you anticipate the USDA will make any significant changes in next Friday's USDA crop report?
That's kind of the big question, is are we going to see yield adjustments from the USDA, any changes in the harvested acreage? A lot of people are trying to speculate, you know, where are we going to go with that? If you had to guess, the trade certainly thinks that corn yield will work lower at some point, and the bean yield's probably going to work higher. So those are going to be the expectations coming in. Whether we get them in October or November or even January is kind of yet to be seen, but they'll have an opportunity next Friday.
Let's look at selling strategies. First, for this crop that's in the field right now, so that would be technically the old crop for corn and soybeans.
Well, on the old crop corn, really we're looking at an opportunity to get back to $4 on the December futures. Corn, the downside feels limited like we had discussed, but I really don't think it has a tremendous amount of upside just because demand will be a little bit questioned as we step into these reports. So it feels like tight trading ranges are going to be pretty common in old crop corn. So look to sell if we can get December up to $4 futures, if you can store that crop, sell some stuff further out to lock in good carries. And in soybeans? Old crop soybeans, trying to buy some time right now. Certainly the prospects aren't real rosy, but if we could get back up to the charts, there's some significant resistance at 923, 925 on November futures. If we can get up to that level, that's probably a spot to look at letting some of your harvest soybeans go. And do you like anything in 2016, or are you starting to think about things for 2016? We'd certainly like to, but with where those numbers are at, it's hard to get too excited. Let's see what develops out of South America this spring as their crop is coming out of the field. If we could get to 9 1/4 off of Nova of 2016, we could sure take a look at some early sales. Again, the USDA's October crop report is scheduled for release Friday, October 9th at 11 a.m. Central Time. We also have a look at hog markets this week with Iowa State Extension livestock economist Lee Schulz. For the 9th straight month, the U.S. pork production in August was above year-ago levels. Producers have been rebounding from the porcine epidemic diarrhea virus that ripped across the country in 2013 and 2014. The recovery has shown in each of the quarterly hogs and pigs reports this year, with inventories higher than the previous year. It was further emphasized in September's report released last week as the USDA tallied the total at 68.4 million head in the United States, the highest since quarterly estimates began in 1988. We talked with Lee Wednesday morning and started by asking how surprising that was.
Well, I think it isn't all that surprising. We've seen all hogs and pigs, record inventory larger than the September 2008 record there. If you look at the market hog inventory, larger than the September 12 record inventory. But again, not all that surprising given expectations coming into the report. We knew we were going to have fairly large pig crops. We knew that likely a little bit of increase in the breeding herd. And again, I think, we've put the porcine epidemic diarrhea virus behind us. Also we're seeing the lowest feed cost since 2007. So I think, not all that surprising given, that we are really back on track as far as herd growth and productivity levels.
I'll ask you to go further on one of those points, the breeding herd and this report. What does it show us about farrowings into fall and into winter?
Well, I think if we look at the breeding herd, up 1.1%, I think it really shows that producers are really making a measured and calculated, emphasis on expansion here. I think we are seeing farrowing intentions below year-ago levels, but again, we need to put those year-ago levels into context given the large farrowings we've seen year ago due to the impact of PEDV. So again, I think, farrowing levels are fairly, in line with what we've seen historically, given, the larger breeding herd. I think that is expectations that we are going to see larger or potentially record pig crops in the coming quarters.
So has herd expansion been appropriate to PEDV, or have producers gone above or below what you thought they might do or what the economics would support?
I think it is very much as expected. When we see the impact of PEDV, producers immediately responded by increasing carcass weight. So that really helped mitigate the impact of the lost slaughter numbers. And as time went on, they also were increasing the breeding herd levels, given really the incentives to do so given the profitability levels. Now we're seeing, increasing breeding herd and farrowing tensions, rather large given historical levels. But I think that shows that, expectations that this is very bullish situation as far as feed costs for the hog industry, as low as 2007 levels. And I think there is still some profits to be made as we go into 2016.
We've seen pork production levels for each month above the year-ago levels. What does that mean for the consumer in the grocery store? Do prices get even cheaper?
Well, prices are down about 9% compared to year-ago levels. That's not too all that unexpected given the increased supplies of pork. And we're likely to see larger pork supplies here in the fourth quarter and into the first quarter of 2016. All else equal, that would suggest that we would see lower pork prices. But I think there is a lot of other factors to keep in mind here. We have the beef supply, relatively tight supplies. It's a growing supply, but that's going to keep beef prices relatively high and pressure pork prices up. On the other end of that, we have increasing broiler supplies, which would put some downward pressure on pork prices potentially. Also, when we look at international demand, we've seen, for the most part, we've seen it be a bit of a drag to pork demand here in 2015. I think there is some indications that international demand will pick up a bit as we're going to see larger supplies and lower prices. But I think we could see pork prices at least stabilize here in the next quarter or so and potentially start to come down even more in 2016.
Yeah, tell me where market prices are now and how they've impacted break-evens.
If we look at market prices, I like to look at them comparable to year-ago levels. We are about 25% below year-ago levels when we look at the futures prices for the fourth quarter. As we get into 2016, those prices could be slightly higher than year-ago levels in 2015. If we look at break-evens, we still are above break-evens on a farrow to finish basis. Break-evens in 2014 were about $74 per hundredweight. 2015, 2016, they're about $65 per hundredweight on a lean basis. So I think profitability levels going into 2016, I think we're looking at that about $10 range on a per head basis for farrow to finish.
Next week, Mike Briggs will join us to look at cattle markets. Nebraska's soybean farmers have harvested 13% of this year's soybean crop, 1 point behind the state's 5-year average. Nebraska Extension educator John Wilson says after harvest is a good time for farmers to test for soybean cyst nematode. John says SCN has already been confirmed in 57 Nebraska counties, and at Husker Harvest Days recently, John says harvest could give you clues of potential problems.
After harvest is a great time to sample for several reasons. First off, it's a time of year when we seem to have a little bit more time on the farm to do something like that. Also, after harvest, we can look at our yield maps, or just from what we remember from harvest, we know where the poor yielding spots were in the field. Now, some of those poor yielding spots are areas that we can't attribute to a difference in soil type or more weed pressure or insect pressure. That would be a spot that we would want to check for SCN. And finally, another good reason is to test in the fall is we might want to sample our corn fields that would be going to soybeans next year, and that way we know if we have SCN present in those fields that we'd want to order reserve resistant varieties for our planting next year.
Nebraska growers can obtain SCN sample bags for free from their local Nebraska Extension office. Negotiations on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, continued this week in Atlanta as the U.S. hosted trade ministers Wednesday and Thursday. This country shipped about 44% of its exports to the 11 other TPP countries in 2013, and as we've stated before, the agreement could be very important to agriculture. Nebraska Extension Public Policy Specialist Brad Lubben joined us this week for an ag policy update, including discussions on country of origin labeling and ag appropriations, but we started by asking for an update on TPP.
We're still waiting for good signs of progress in the Trans-Pacific Partnership talks. We were at this stage earlier this year when we passed Trade Promotion Authority and gave the administration really the leverage to try and finish negotiations. But we still have some very difficult hurdles to cross to get to a final agreement.
What are those final hurdles?
Well, clearly you have an ag sector in the United States that is looking for expanded access and opportunities in that TPP region, the Southeast Asian and Pacific Rim countries. But we also have a number of tariff and other border measures that restrict trade, and we have some domestic programs in other countries that are concerning. So amongst the hurdles is the continued restrictions on imports into Japan. But when we ask for relief from Japan, they ask for measures in other economic areas like automobiles and others that affect U.S. interests. But you also have dairy in Canada and other issues elsewhere that mean this is not easy to put to bed.
Is there a realistic time frame of when you think this could go?
Well, it seems as if we are up against the hurdle, and the question is, if you're willing to get across that hurdle, it can happen at any time. If the countries continue to sort of dance around that hurdle and keep forestalling the commitment, then this could be, unfortunately, could seem like an indefinite debate.
We talked months ago about cool issues between the U.S. and Mexico and Canada. Where are we in that process?
Right. Other trade issues, of course, remember cool, country of origin labeling. After many years of debate and several decisions at WTO, we know that the U.S. is in a position where they face a ruling that cool is out of compliance and has to be changed. The question is how bad or how much damage has occurred. Canada and Mexico filed under the arbitration clause to assess damages. The debate is, it's as far apart as a U.S. argument that the damages are less than 100 million and a Canada and Mexico argument that the damages are as much as 3 billion. So somewhere in there the arbitration ruling would find what damages from cool have really been to those two countries. That doesn't mean that we suddenly start paying damages and leave cool alone, but it does mean that we get to the point where we actually sort of force something to happen. And that something seems to be increasingly likely, that you either repeal cool altogether or you look at some proposed legislation that tries to establish a voluntary labeling regime for cool as opposed to the mandatory one.
Let's focus on Washington, D.C. and now into October. That transition between September and October brought again another debate about whether the federal government would shut down on October 1st. Right. How does that debate relate to agriculture?
Well, it's unfortunate and challenging that we seem to keep having this debate year in and year out. The likelihood that we have a continuing resolution here to fund at least the beginning of fiscal 16, that'll keep the government offices open and programs running, but it doesn't really allow us to make changes. It doesn't allow us to bring about policy changes and new priorities. The other thing it doesn't really give us much hope for is any resolution in the budget and appropriations process anytime soon. We're only beginning the election cycle here. If you can't finish an appropriations bill in an off year, you're certainly not likely to finish it in an election year either. So we could be looking at 2 years or so of continuing resolutions because you can't come up with a full bill.
We know that producers are supposed to expect payments for ARC and PLC in October. Are those in danger at all?
Right. With the continuing resolution, we know programs are running. We know the offices will be there to calculate and distribute payments. We do also know that payments are subject to something called budget sequestration. This actually dates back to 2011, which was an earlier time when we needed to come to a grand agreement on budget and spending, and the argument was if you can't come to the grand agreement, you'll automatically implement something called sequestration and take a percentage reduction in those accounts. We've been living with sequestration ever since, and we'll likely see a 7% or so reduction in farm program payments that are paid out here in October because of it.
Our coverage from Japan earlier this year contains more specific information on how the TPP could impact ag trade. You can find those reports under the MJ Extras tab on the Market Journal website. The September Nebraska Farmer says you've heard about Google Glass, Apple Watch, and Fitbit, but how about wearable technology for cattle? Quantified Ag, a Lincoln-based startup company, has put wearable technology in the form of biometric ear tags to work to identify sick cattle early. A receiver in the feed yard takes signals from multiple tags and sends the data to a central system where it's aggregated. Algorithms flag animals showing signs of illness and sends alerts to pen riders. To read more about the potential this technology holds in early identification of sick cattle, you can check out the September Nebraska Farmer. The latest crop progress report put the fourth cutting of alfalfa in Nebraska at 90% complete, 11 points ahead of average. 67% of that alfalfa was rated good to excellent. Earlier this week, we talked with Nebraska Extension forage specialist Bruce Anderson to see if it's too late to cut alfalfa in October.
Well, that's a question we've been getting a lot of lately, Jeff, and I think a lot of it stems from all the moisture a lot of folks have been getting. We've had good growing conditions, we've had good moisture, and so after taking the last cutting, alfalfa kept right on growing this year, and it is really tempting to take a cutting right now. Usually hay that's cut this time of the year can be real high quality, give us that last kind of benefit from the year, and we want to do so, but we've got to think about a couple of things real carefully before we pull the trigger on doing a cutting this time of year.
What are those things that you must do differently?
Well, we certainly with alfalfa want to keep it in good shape so that it's going to grow well next year. So winter hardiness is a critical factor. And usually from about mid-September to mid-October, the alfalfa plants are going through their winter hardening process. And when we cut it during that time frame, we kind of jeopardize a little bit of the plant's ability to do that process properly. So we got to look at some other characteristics if we really are going to be cutting. Characteristics such as how long has it been since the last cutting. I like to use a rule of thumb that is, if we have had 6 weeks of growth since our last cutting, harvest during this winterizing period really isn't very dangerous to stand persistence. We can take that cutting and do it in pretty good shape.
Outside of that, though, it is dangerous?
Outside of that, I think we're going to end up with at least some loss of vigor next spring, so that the first cutting that we have is going to have a little lower yield. We'll see the plants green up a little slower, they're going to grow a little slower, and so we'll sacrifice some first cutting yield, but that may not be real critical for a lot of people because the cutting that they take now is going to be very high quality. Maybe the hay that they get next spring isn't going to be quite as good, and if they can use it this fall versus just storing it over winter for next year, it may be very valuable to them.
Can you graze it?
We can graze it, and that's one of the real good ways of using this October alfalfa, but be really careful about bloat. While those plants are still green and lush, bloat is a real big risk. Usually for fall grazing, we're going to be looking at waiting until we've had a couple of good hard freezes, getting down below 24, 22 degrees, and seeing the alfalfa plants actually start to do some wilting in order to be more certain that bloat risk is going to be lowered. But it's never zero, so we've always got to be somewhat careful of it.
What role would a hard freeze play in this? Is that a wild card at all?
Well, it is a bit of a wild card. It's a major one for the grazing, as we just mentioned, but even for the harvesting, typically once that plant goes dormant or is really set into winter by a hard freeze, the amount of damage that we may produce on that plant by taking a harvest is really minimized. So taking a harvest right after a hard freeze can be a safe way of using that alfalfa, but it should be done very quickly after that hard freeze, because if the plant starts to wilt, it can lose its leaves real quickly, which means quality and yield are going to go down rapidly.
Is that hard freeze a danger to any other forage you might use or graze?
Yeah, well, hard freeze can be a problem for a lot of different forages, can affect the toxicity risks that we may have with things like Sudan grass or sorghums that we have out there for grazing by releasing prussic acid for a few days. Other grasses may accumulate nitrates for a brief period of time after a hard freeze. So usually for a lot of feeds that we're going to be grazing especially, we want to wait 3 to 5 days after that hard freeze to let the plants kind of readjust to those new conditions before we take the risk of those toxins being a problem for us.
Now with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we again for the weekly forecast. During this last week, we had several pieces of energy move across the state. The first one that moved through was a Sunday night to Monday time frame. We've seen some localized heavy precipitation in isolated spots in north central and northeast Nebraska, along with east central Nebraska, particularly around the Lincoln metropolitan area. Now, the models last week brought all this energy out in one big large piece from the Tuesday night time frame through the Thursday time frame. In fact, reality was the first piece of energy came through early, and then we did see another piece of energy move through as we got into the midweek period, and that's carried on through the end of this week. And most of the precipitation at this point has been fairly light in nature. Although it's welcome, we still would like to see some widespread good precipitation in the 1.5 inch to 1.5 inch range across the western part of the state, particularly with wheat planting in progress. Now, the big fly in the ointment over this next week is going to be, one, we have a hurricane in the eastern United States, at least off of the eastern United States seaboard, and that may impact the movement of systems that are coming in the western United States in terms of their speed and their eventual storm track. So let's take a look at the upper air models and see what we have in store. First, I'll draw your attention to the western United States. We have this large upper air low that's slowly going to make its way down toward southern California. And in the eastern United States, we are looking at the cutoff upper air low over the Florida Panhandle and offshore over the Bahamas. We do have a hurricane that's going to slowly make its way northward and increase in speed as we go into tomorrow as it gets up into the mid-Atlantic region. Ultimately, the decision is whether or not this comes inshore over Cape Hatteras, whether it comes inshore up into New Jersey, or it stays offshore. And right now the models are zeroing in on somewhere between Cape Hatteras and New Jersey as a landfall, although the European model has been the best performing model lately, and that does keep it well off ashore. So as we get into tomorrow, we're going to be looking at that low off the western United States dropping down into southern California. We'll start to see warmer temperatures invade most of the central plains, and that'll bring an end to any of the precipitation that fell across the western half of the state, particularly during the second half of the day. And we will see some nicer conditions continue into the day on Monday as ridging takes place, and this low starts to make its way toward the east. Slowly but surely it's going to make its way toward Nebraska. Here's what the GFS is saying: the hurricane comes ashore sometime as we get into late Sunday into early Monday, close to New York City. And then as we get into Tuesday, we'll start to see this system starting to open up. That'll bring some very nice warm air into the central plains. Nice break after these very cool conditions the last few days, and precipitation will be on the uptick, particularly as we get into the central Rockies and some of that spilling out into the Panhandle. Now, as we get into Wednesday, we'll start to see that low make its way toward the Texas Panhandle, but we are showing precipitation breaking out across the Panhandle in southern Nebraska, a little bit northern drift to this upper air low, and we'll see widespread precipitation statewide. As we get into Thursday, the system makes its way into the Texas Panhandle, and we'll still continue to see the chance for above normal moisture across the southern 1/3 of the state. And as we get into Friday, now the system starts to direct its way movement toward the eastern Corn Belt, and that will leave Nebraska pretty much high and down in cooler conditions. So as we look at the temperature forecast, we're looking at cool conditions this weekend, giving way to a slight trend in warming during the midweek period before once again we start to increase precipitation from west to east, and that continues through the end of the week. 8 to 14-day forecast from next Thursday to the following Tuesday once again rebuilds the warmth into our region, and in terms of precipitation keeps us in the above normal moisture for at least the foreseeable future.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews can be found individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean markets, hog prices, soybean cyst nematode, ag appropriations, and cutting late season alfalfa. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Next week, Mike Briggs will be our cattle market analyst, and Tamara Jackson-Zims will talk about ear rots in corn. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.